I've always loved gangster movies, and gangster movies are about villains, so making this list is a no-brainer. Now, this list will only include movies that are actually about gangsters, not movies that just happens to feature gangsters. So you won't see the likes of The Dark Knight on here. Seriously, if you think The Dark Knight is a gangster movie, you clearly need to watch more movies. Anyway, here we go. Number 10, Donnie Brasco. Based on the true story of FBI agent Joseph Pistone, who went undercover and infiltrated the New York Mafia in the 1970s. Pistone, who went by the name Donnie Brasco while undercover, was played by Johnny Depp in the movie. As far as I can tell, it's a fairly faithful adaptation of what actually happened, which isn't so surprising, as the movie is based on Pistone's own book about the events, and he also worked as a consultant on the production. It's a very tragic and sad story. The focus is on the relationship between Pistone and the man who took him into the mob. The guy he duped, basically. Lefty Ruggiero, played by Al Pacino. The two actually become close friends, a sort of unfortunate accident. It puts Pistone in a rather uncomfortable situation, as he's basically there to nail Lefty. We also see how the gangster life changes Pistone, and as he's forced to commit horrible acts, he slowly begins to transform into an actual gangster. Lefty himself is also a very tragic character. He's been with the mob for decades, and always been loyal, and always done what he was told. Yet he's still basically just a foot soldier. He's seeing younger guys rise to the status of bosses while he remains on the sidelines. He also lives in fair poverty and has a heroin-addicted loser son. If this is 100% accurate to the truth, I don't know. But as a movie character, Al Pacino's Lefty Ruggiero remains one of cinema's most tragic gangsters. Number 9. Once Upon a Time in America. Legendary spaghetti western director Sergio Leone's final movie. This epic spans several decades, exploring the lives and crimes of a group of Jewish New York gangsters. It begins in the 1910s, when the group are just kids, living in poverty in the slums of Manhattan. We then see them grow as a gang, and by 1930, they're highly successful bootleggers. The finale of the movie takes place in the late 60s, when they're old men and have had a falling out. That's the plot in very broad strokes. There's a lot more to it, but I of course can't get into all of that on this list. The main focus is on two members of the gang, Noodles and Maxie, played by Robert De Niro and James Woods respectively. They start off as very good friends, but as time goes on, it becomes apparent that Noodles can't quite keep up with Maxie's aggressive ambitions. While Maxie basically wants the whole world, Noodles is pretty much content with what they've got. He seems to prefer to just woo his old childhood crush and get high on opium. Clearly a partnership that can't last forever. That's the main gist of the movie, broken friendships. It's a very brutal movie. It doesn't romanticize anything, and most of the characters are pretty scummy. Despite the movie being about friendship, it's hard to sympathize with anyone in it. But that's of course the point. The world of the gangster is brutal, and Leone wants to show that. Ironically though, in a lot of ways the movie is also pretty beautiful. It's poetic in nature, despite its blunt brutality. The scope is so epic, the music by Ennio Morricone is breathtaking, and few films have been able to capture the look and feel of early 20th century New York so well. Number 8. The Roaring Twenties. An old James Cagney classic. As the title suggests, it takes place in the 1920s, but it was made in 1939. In other words, a very adjacent throwback to the Roaring Twenties. The people who made it actually lived through the 1920s and Prohibition. The movie was a sort of nostalgia trip at the time, and that sure shows, as it was made with very rose-tinted glasses. This movie is not brutal or realistic at all. Instead, it's as romanticized as it gets. It tells the story of Eddie Bartlett, Cagney, a veteran of World War I, who comes home to a country that wants nothing to do with him. During his absence, all jobs have been filled, and with no money in his pocket, he has no choice but to turn to bootlegging. As the 20s go on, his organization rises, and eventually he's the biggest crime lord in the city. But of course, as it is with all of these movies, nothing lasts forever. Like I said, it's not a brutal story, but it is a very sad story. Eddie Bartlett is a very sympathetic character. He's forced into crime in order to not starve, and he never becomes a genuinely evil guy. He's always fair and very loyal, and the only times he kills is in self-defense. He's really more of an anti-hero rather than a villain. So yeah, not too realistic. But that's the charm of this movie. It's also very glamorous, as many scenes takes place in nightclubs, and we get numerous song numbers, primarily by actress and singer Priscilla Lane. This movie is chock full of olden goldies of the 20s, like My Melancholy Baby and It Had to Be You. And of course, this just adds to the charm and 1920s vibe. This is one of those movies that makes you nostalgic for a time you didn't even experience. Naturally, I gotta mention Humphrey Bogart too. This was a couple of years before he became a big star, and he does a really great job here at portraying Cagney's right-hand man. Probably a more realistic gangster, as he is actually very evil and kinda psychotic too. Number 7. Goodfellas. Here we have one of the big ones. One of the most famous and iconic gangster movies ever made. Martin Scorsese's highly influential classic. This is another one that's based on true events. It tells the story of Henry Hill, played by Ray Liotta, a kid who always wanted to be a gangster and grew up to become one. And of course later turned rat and went into a witness protection program. I don't think that's a spoiler, as it happened in real life after all, and a long time ago too. Most of you probably knew it. Like a lot of Scorsese movies, Goodfellas takes a very intimate and down-to-earth approach to its subject matter. It's basically about the day-to-day lives of these characters. Characters who just happens to be mobsters. It shows that while these people are criminals, they're people too. However, it does not romanticize them. That's the beauty of Goodfellas. It just shows how it is, matter-of-factly, without any bias. One day they're cooking food with the family or hanging out in a nightclub with friends, and the next they're chopping someone up. Is it right? Is it wrong? Goodfellas does not care. It just shows. Even the movie's most evil and vile character, Tommy DeVito, played by Joe Pesci, is portrayed in an unbiased and matter-of-factly way. Yeah, one day he's killing people for no real reason, but the next he's having a nice meal with his mother or going on a date. As such, I'd say Goodfellas is probably the most realistic gangster movie ever made. It's almost like a documentary. Number 6. Reservoir Dogs. Another iconic classic, Tarantino's very first movie, and it's still his best in my opinion. Sorry, Pulp Fiction, I love you too though. The only heist movie on this list, and ironically, it's not even about the heist itself. Instead, the movie focuses on the aftermath of the heist, a diamond heist gone wrong. The perpetrators, or what's left of them, gather up at the designated meetup and try to figure out what went wrong and who's responsible. None of them know each other either, as they were all hired for the job by a local mob boss. They don't even know each other's names, instead using code names. This of course just further fuels their conflict and paranoia. Someone's a rat, but who is it? Unlike most of Tarantino's movies, this one is pretty blunt and straight to the point. There's no Tarantino self-indulgence or silliness. Not that I don't enjoy that, but it is nice to see the guy just tell a story. A pretty simple and basic story. It's not as stylized as his later movies either, but still more stylized than the other movies on this list. I mean seriously, bank robbers don't wear identical suits and sunglasses in real life. It sure looks cool though. Great dialogue and acting performances further elevates the material, and we get some of the most memorable movie gangsters in cinema history. The standouts in my opinion being Steve Buscemi's sarcastic and snarky Mr. Pink, and Michael Madsen's psychotic and terrifying Mr. Blonde. Number 5. Johnny Eager. Now this is a pretty odd choice. You won't see this one on many lists. First of all, it's pretty forgotten, and second of all, most people probably consider it too romantic. It is a romance movie, but it is also a gangster movie. And for some reason, I just have a really soft spot for it. I don't really know why. Anyway, the plot is about the eponymous Johnny Eager, played by Robert Taylor, a suave mob boss and cold-hearted ladies' man. This guy has a real knack for using people, especially women. He's got an entire army of simping women who are willing to do anything for him. Then, of course, one day he meets a woman he actually cares about, played by Lana Turner. He also cares about his right-hand man, a poetic alcoholic, played by Van Heflin. A pretty useless guy, but Johnny still keeps him around. So, slowly it becomes apparent that Johnny isn't quite as cold-hearted as it seems, and deep down inside a criminal there's actually a human. Yeah, the movie is a bit sappy, but somehow it works. It doesn't come off as hokey or goofy. Instead, it just comes off as an unusual gangster story, a very unique gangster story. Robert Taylor, who was often pretty wooden in his roles, for once does a great job. With his Hollywood good looks and his stoic nature, he was a perfect choice. His chemistry with the sultry Lana Turner is also off the charts. And Van Heflin is also very memorable as a very unusual gangster character, a philosophical gangster who constantly quotes classic literature. Plus, there's the 1940s atmosphere and style to the picture, of course. If you made this movie today, it just wouldn't be the same. Number 4. White Heat. Another 1940s gangster flick. This one is not obscure though. It's another James Cagney classic, and arguably his most famous picture too. This is the movie where the famous line, "Top of the world, ma," comes from. In this one, Cagney plays Cody Jarrett, a far cry from the sympathetic and almost heroic Eddie Bartlett from the Roaring Twenties. Jarrett is a complete psychopath and a cold-blooded killer. Not a very nice guy. He also suffers from mental issues and has frequent attacks where he feels sharp pains in his head. Whether these attacks are imaginary or not is left ambiguous. And did I mention the guy also has a weird fixation on his mother? His ma is part of the crew and helps her dear son plan their capers. She's a sort of Ma Barker type character, and Jarrett seems way more interested in her than his smoking hot wife. Yeah, the guy is really weird. In a nutshell, the movie's plot follows Jarrett and his crew through a series of capers, while a government agent is sent to infiltrate their merry gang. It's all good stuff. But what of course makes the picture is Cagney and the Jarrett character. Cagney gives perhaps the greatest performance of his career, and Jarrett is a very layered and complex character. He's very evil, yes, but the guy is clearly disturbed, and he does also have a softer side. He loves his mother, we've already established that, but he can also show great friendship and loyalty if you earn his trust. Unfortunately for him, the guy who happens to earn his trust is the government agent. Number 3. The Godfather. Yep, here it is. The big one. The big obvious one. No list of favorite gangster movies will be missing this one. Not only is it considered one of the best and most iconic gangster movies, but it's usually considered one of the best and most iconic movies in general. It's even become a cliche to put The Godfather on your list of favorite movies. It's like Citizen Kane, everyone groans when they show up on movie lists. But I mean, on a list of gangster movies, you gotta include The Godfather. And it does deserve it too. It is one of the best gangster movies ever made. It was the first movie to really explore the Italian mafia in a realistic way, show the public how they actually work and the types of phrases they use. Everything that came before was very Hollywood and made up. And as cliché as he's become, Marlon Brando's Vito Corleone is a really fantastic character. He's so sympathetic, so reasonable, and most of all, so fatherly that you even forget he's a criminal. He comes off as a good guy. I think my favorite part about the movie is Michael Corleone though, Vito's youngest son played by Al Pacino. What a sad and tragic story his is. He was the only son not involved in the so-called family business, and that's how both he and his father liked it. He was kept pure. But that was all ruined, of course, when he was pulled into their world out of necessity. He just wanted to help his family when they were in trouble, his father especially, and as a result he ends up becoming the new leader of their criminal empire, and with no way out. Just goes to show you that while your family can be a great source of love, support and companionship, they can also be a gigantic burden and your ultimate doom. Number 2. The Public Enemy. James Cagney's first big movie, and one of the first gangster movies ever made. Made in 1931, Prohibition was still around. You just can't beat that kind of atmosphere. The story is about Tom Powers and his best friend Matt, two hoodlums who start out as petty criminals in the 1910s and then become enforcers for a powerful bootlegger in the 20s. A rags to riches tale, and a very brutal one. This is another movie where Cagney plays a pretty unsympathetic character. I mean, honestly, this guy is a real asshole. Not heroic whatsoever. He beats up innocent people, executes people while they're begging on their knees. Then, of course, let's not forget the famous scene where he jams a piece of grapefruit into his girlfriend's face. And for no real reason either, he was just tired of her. Yeah, a total scumbag. Well, pretty much. He does have a softer side. He loves his family, including his ma again. This one is very different though, as she refuses to believe her son is even a criminal. He also cares a lot about his best friend Matt. So while he is pretty despicable, he's still portrayed as a three-dimensional person and not a stock cardboard villain. Unlike other gangster movies of the time, this one actually feels pretty realistic. It's not romanticized or sappy in any way. Instead, it's very gritty and upfront with the brutality of crime. I remember the first time I saw it, I was 14, and when it was over I felt like I'd been punched in the gut. And mind you, I'd seen tons of gory horror movies, so I wasn't some sissy. It's just the honest and gritty way the story is told, and of course, Cagney's incredibly explosive performance. Besides all of these points, another big reason I love the movie so much and place it as my number 2 is the fact it was made in 1931, during the actual reign of bootleggers, and when sound movies were a new thing, or talkies as they called them back then, and it was pre-Hays Code, before Hollywood started to censor itself in 1934, which is obviously why this one is more brutal than later gangster movies of the period. There's just a lot of really fascinating historical aspects to The Public Enemy, plus it's a great movie too. I much prefer it to its two big contemporaries, Little Caesar and Scarface. It's just a far superior film in my opinion, and if you're only gonna pick one out of the big three, I say go with The Public Enemy. And now for my favorite gangster movie of all time. Number 1, Scarface. And yes, I do mean the remake from the 1980s, obviously. As for the original, I don't like it at all. It's really goofy and feels a lot more dated than The Public Enemy. Anyway, Al Pacino's Scarface. The only gangster movie that rivals The Godfather in fame. And Pacino's Tony Montana is the only movie gangster who rivals Vito Corleone in iconography. I honestly couldn't tell you who between the two have been parodied and mimicked the most. The movie is about Cuban refugee Tony Montana, who arrives in Miami in the early 80s. Tony is determined to achieve the American dream. His view of that dream just happens to be a bit twisted. He's going to achieve it through crime. He starts off as a petty minion for a local mob boss, but very quickly rises among the ranks, and soon he runs the entire organization. But of course, with such an explosive personality as he has, it's not gonna last for long. Yeah, it's a pretty basic gangster plot, very similar to many others on the list, but in my opinion, this movie does it the best. And you just can't beat the 80s Miami vibe the movie's got. The colors, the music, the clothes, it's all just so appealing. Well, maybe not the haircuts. And Tony Montana, cliché as it might be, is in my opinion the greatest movie gangster of all time. He is a very complex character. He can be brutal, but he's not genuinely evil. He's got rules and codes, unlike most of his colleagues. There are lines he won't cross, and he cares about his family. He cares a little too much about his sister though. Yet another movie gangster with an unhealthy fixation on a family member. I don't know what that's all about. Tony is very likable, but he's also pretty fucked up. And it isn't just his sister fixation. The guy seems hell-bent on self-destruction. He's reaching for far too much and he's pissing people off left and right. It's like secretly he wants to fail, like deep down he hates himself or something. The guy is really fascinating and very messed up. Pacino does a fantastic job in the role too, giving a super dynamic, larger-than-life performance. It's kinda funny when you compare Tony Montana to Michael Corleone. They're such different characters, it barely feels like the same actor is playing them. Scarface is just one of those movies I can watch over and over and never get tired of. And there you have it. My top 10 favorite gangster movies. Let me know yours in the comments. And as always, remember, Arkham Asylum awaits you in the next video.